Our, our speaker tonight is Michael R., and he is from Benton Soil Water Conservation District and joined there in April 2021. And in that capacity, oversees conservation programs as well as coordinates the Willamette Main Stem Cooperative and Invasive Species Program. Much of the Willamette Valley River work that Michael manages relates to aquatic invasive species. And in the uplands, the focus has been on oblong spurge, an A-list noxious weed. Over the last couple of years, Michael has been working on more general outreach to homeowners and gardeners about a variety of weeds that they can manage for the good of the community. Prior to his work at Benton Soil Water Conservation District, Michael worked at West Multnomah Soil Water Conservation District for 11 years, assisting woodland owners in conservation. He has a BS from Ohio State University in Wildlife Management and an MS from the Oregon State University College of Forestry, where he focused on natural resources, education, and extension. So please welcome Michael, who's going to talk about invasive species to us tonight. Thanks.
So do we know if the Zoom crowd can definitely see it?
I can ask in the chat also.
Oh, I haven't hit the share screen yet, so there's no way, right?
Rob, you can see your face, but not the.
Okay. Let's see if that way works.
Yep. Okay.
Oh, good. That's great. All right. So this talk tonight isn't set up to be, let's see. You might be able to turn that off. This isn't set up to be like a quiz or anything, but does anyone just for fun know what this weed is at the top? I heard someone say lesser celandine. That's the correct answer there. So that's one of the ones we can chat about today. It's kind of a fake out because you'd think it'd be oblong spurge after that lead in, and it is a yellow flower, but this is lesser celandine. So my name is Michael R., and I work for the Benton Soil and Water Conservation District, and I've been there about 3 years, and I do work on Willamette River stuff, upland weeds, and a few other things. But one of the big things I think is fun to do is come out and talk to folks about these common invasive species you might find in your yards around Philomath or Corvallis or other Benton County kind of urban areas or suburban areas that we kind of care about people taking care of because they have the potential to move out into the more wild lands or natural areas where they could affect ecosystems and habitat and things like that. So that's kind of what I'll get into today. Let's see if I can get this to advance. I might want to hit that button to do it. Or this one.
There you go.
Cool. Now we're talking. All right. So just a quick outline of tonight's talk is that I'll kind of define what weeds are in real basic terms at first and talk about some basic principles and removal. And then I'll go through kind of a top 10 list that's somewhat vetted with the Benton Cooperative Weed Management Areas, which is a bunch of partners that come together a couple times a year to talk about invasive weeds and things. But it's got a little bit of my own personal probably opinions mixed into it too. And then we have time for questions, and this is an informal presentation. And so you can always raise your hand and kind of interrupt as we go. So with that, whenever you get up in front of folks when you work for a soil and water conservation district, you got to take 1 minute to talk about what those are. Has anyone here ever collaborated with the SWCD before? The Benton Soil and Water? All right. Got a few pros in the back here. Yeah, so basically this picture right here is of the Dust Bowl, and I put that up there because back in the Great Depression and the times of the Dust Bowl, it was, really hard time, but it was exacerbated by the fact that we weren't really using all these conservation farming practices at that time. So it didn't help that there was no rain and there was wind and there was all these things, but really soil science was born from the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, where we realized there's a lot of things we could do to kind of use, whether it be use cover crops or prevent erosion or just change up our kind of rigorous farming practices that we could keep the soil more on the ground and not up in the air. And then at that time, we, oh yeah, you can just see it, my stomach. Oh my gosh. Then over time, we have come together to like create things like the Soil Conservation Service, which was a federal agency that later became the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And now there's SWCDs in every county in Oregon and covering most counties of the United States. So, so we do work like some people might have met Teresa Madison before, one of my coworkers who does a lot of soil work, or Donna Schmitz, who does a lot of resource conservation work and habitat projects, and other folks that work at the district. There's 6 of us all together right now. So just to kind of jump into the topic of weeds a little bit then, is really when it comes down to weeds, we're thinking about plant competition in a lot of cases. So that'd be the truth if you were like out there just trying to make sure that your tomatoes were growing well, you want to reduce the competition. It happens in Douglas fir forests, like you see in the top picture here, where you've got really tight spacing on these trees and there's really nothing growing underneath of them because there's no sunlight. And it could even happen in, you know, in your yard with some landscaping. I don't know if, oh, I can move my arrow around, I think, to the Zoom people put out for you. But this bottom photo is just kind of like a yard where there's a lot of cool plants and a lot of them are probably desirable, but they're even certainly competing with one another. So we get into the term sometimes of calling things weeds, and that's often just a plant that's out of place. Maybe it's a plant that's a nuisance, or just those unwanted plants, again, next to your tomatoes or things like that that are competing with your crops. But at the Soil and Water Conservation District level, we get, oh wait, I might have just jumped ahead one slide. Let me see. I might have, okay, I can just confuse myself as well. So, at the Soil and Water Conservation District level, we start to think about noxious weeds, and those are more defined as typically weeds that come from other regions of the United States or of the world. Most of the ones that we'll talk about tonight come from other regions of the world, not just, you know, from Virginia or something like that. They're usually highly competitive. Sometimes they're capable of causing issues like health concerns, like that might be this oblong spurge in here. Actually, the sap of that is mildly toxic and will give you a rash. It can blind you if it flings into your eyes. We have things like poison hemlock that have some of the same characteristics, or we might even have tansy ragwort that if your livestock eat it, they get very sick or they can even die from that. We have a lot of economic damage to farms, forests, and ranch land from noxious weeds. And you'll hear me a lot this evening talking about kind of the harm that we have to ecosystems from these noxious weeds getting out into the more natural environment. So that last picture was oblong spurge, and it could displace this good plant, which is camas. So that'd be just kind of an example of your ecosystems. You'd rather see this growing underneath your oak woodland rather than the, or oak savanna rather than that oblong spurge. And so just a little bit more context about how state agencies or soil and water conservation districts think about noxious weeds is the Oregon Department of Agriculture keeps a noxious weed list that they refine each year. They might offer, they might take some weeds off of it that aren't really that big of a concern at all anymore, or they might add new weeds to that list. And on that list, the bulk of them, and there's more than 100 weeds on this list, the bulk of them are B list species. And those are going to be blackberry, canary grass, and Scotch broom and things like that, that we're never going to eradicate from Oregon at this point, but you still might want to control them. And you're encouraged to. But A-list species are more of a higher priority. Those are ones we think we can actually eradicate from Oregon. And those are the species that organizations like mine can often get even extra funding to help people remove. So I'll give an example of that with the Oblong Spurge project. And then T-list species are kind of like a sort of in-between sort of thing. And I'll bring those up just for a minute at the end. I'm not going to spend time on them right this minute. So just like some really basic principles of weed removal, and this might seem like the most obvious slide in the world, but like really with a weed, the best thing you could do is remove it physically from your property by getting the roots, the stem, the leaves, the flower, the seeds, and everything out of there. And there's occasionally weeds that you can simply just do that with. Oftentimes things get a lot more complicated than that. Like there's already a seed bed, or you can't get the roots without splitting them up into fragments and things like that. But it is important to just sometimes remember, like instead of going out and buying a lot of different chemicals to spray or things like that, that you might just be able to pull some of these weeds. And there are some that you can do that with. Kind of a fun photo in the middle there is these special bags that are made that say noxious weeds do not put in yard waste. And those were created in the Portland area specifically, and we use them down here too. But what would happen is sometimes folks would take these nasty weeds, throw them into garbage bags, send them to the Metro transfer station, which is kind of like the dump basically there, but it's in more of this like indoor building with conveyor belts and things. And so staff there would go, oh my gosh, that's a bunch of yard debris. That shouldn't go in the garbage. And they would grab them and divert them to compost. And so they started making these bags to be more of a warning, like, don't let this go to garbage. And so what would be the reason that you wouldn't want the weeds to go to compost and you want to make sure they went to the landfill instead? It's another quiz question. What do you think?
Seeds, compost at its proper temperature, and I guess the plant can survive.
Yep, that's it. You were just worried that still seeds or plant parts could somehow get through the system without a really high temperature that makes them, you know, innocuous or whatever, and they could still end up growing somewhere else. Because sometimes that compost material ends up being sold or used as mulch or things like that later. So anyway, that's an important thing to do, is think about how we dispose of plants, and that'll come up a few times here. I won't spend a bunch of time on this slide, but just to say, seeds come in all different shapes and sizes. You get these really cool, like fruity looking ones on the left that are on these cool stalks, or you might have saliques, like the garlic mustard in the middle, where those are the little bunch of little seeds and those little like long protrusions. And then you get your dandelions or knapweeds and things like that here that have that kind of tuft on them. And so we often want to remove weeds before they go to seed. That can be really obvious sounding, but I have seen examples of people that have had a lot of invasive weeds that have all already gone to seed, and they're spraying herbicides all over them. And it's like all those weeds you're hitting right now have already done their damage. It's really next spring that you need to worry about those weeds. And so I hate to see herbicides out on the ground or a bunch of hand pulling effort that's not really leading to much. This will get back in a little bit to how you dispose of plants. So we don't just reproduce as plants as seeds. We can also reproduce through vegetative ways, like this knotweed that's at the top here. If you were to cut that down and throw that in someone's yard down the street, it can actually just grow again. Just the branches, any little part of that plant can pretty much grow into a new plant. And then you get other times where you might cut something like a hawthorn or a holly or something like that, and it'll actually sprout from the stump that you can see at the bottom. So we have to be thoughtful about if that's going to happen. Sometimes we can make our problems even worse if we don't dispose of things quite the way we intended. And then another just basic weed principle would just be shade tolerance. So things like I wrote on here too, it's kind of confusing. I have like blackberry, scotch broom, reed canary grass written here. Those would actually be species that are not shade tolerant. They want to see the sun, so you can actually shade those weeds out by just growing trees over them or using shade cloth and things like that. The ones in these pictures here, where you have holly on the top left and geranium on the bottom left and ivy on the right, those are shade tolerant species. So those are species that without active management, you're going to have them perhaps forever growing in the space where they're at. So ivy, holly, they can grow in very, very dark spaces. So those, you can't just wait around. If you really want to get rid of them, you got to get pretty active with those. All right. So invasives in yards. So this is a picture, kind of, sorry if it's your place, but this is just down the street from me, kind of in the Witham Hill area in general. And does anyone know what species of tree these two are? So those are Oregon white oak trees right there, which we're fortunate enough on my street to have a lot of those, which is cool. And Oregon white oak, there's not nearly as many Oregon white oak as there used to be, right? We've lost more than 90% of our Oregon white oak, and we've found that they're very, very valuable habitat trees for hundreds of species of wildlife. And so even in a neighborhood, they could be really important. So we don't really love seeing ivy grow up them like in that picture. And we don't really love to see the holly that's in this picture or the periwinkle that's growing behind it, which is vinca major or vinca minor. And there's probably even a few other weeds in here too. I'm not even so sure about, sometimes we can even have like yellow flag iris in places, but this might be more like daffodils. So anyway, the point with this one is like in that section of town, as you're getting out to like Witham Hill or going out towards Timber Hill, you're getting out towards the forest and the more wild spaces of Corvallis. And so those are areas where weeds have the tendency to sometimes move from town out into the more like native and natural habitats. But also it's important just to take care of our, I lost my arrows somehow. Will that work? No. It's over here now. Wait. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, now I know what to do. But then there's also books like this, like Doug Tallamy. This is a really popular book. Several of you probably own it or have looked at it at the library or something. But Doug Tallamy does a really good job in this book of talking about how just the nature and the habitat we provide in our yards all across the United States is so important. And just uses a lot of great examples of songbirds feeding their young with the caterpillars that they get off native plants and shrubs and things in people's yards. So it's really important for us to take care of our yards for habitat because animals use that space, as you guys all know. So now I'll go through a little bit of like the most wanted list, but really the most wanted plant is this first one. And so this is oblong spurge. And I like to highlight it right off the bat because it is the one A-list species that I'll show tonight, meaning that we have grant money to help people get rid of it if they know they have it. And it's just really important on the scale of Oregon to get rid of this weed. And when we first started looking for oblong spurge in Corvallis, we never really were like technically looking for it, but someone who was a biologist noticed it in a yard while they were like hanging out with friends over kind of by the fairgrounds. And we for a while started to do like a campaign to figure out if there was a lot more oblong spurge out there. And we had it on 4 sites. And by the next year, I think we had it on like 9 sites. So it wasn't any exponential growth, but now we're up to 50 sites that we know of with oblong spurge. And one of the things with it is it was planted on purpose. Like a lot of people bought it because it's a pretty cool, nice, showy yellow flower.
That's my question. Do you nurseries sell it?
Not anymore. So if you're a nursery in Oregon, you can't sell anything that's on the noxious weed list. Sometimes there's ways to get things online. And sometimes, and we'll talk about this, is there's weeds that I would personally say are absolutely noxious weeds, but they're not on the list. So then you can still sell them.
Would you repeat the question when somebody,
Yeah.
so that people on Zoom know?
So the quick question was like, could people still buy this one? And so the answer is no. Like maybe there's a way to somehow get it, online or something. But this one, whenever I search this one a lot because I work with it a lot, and I don't tend to find nursery sites of people selling this one. I think the word's pretty good, pretty out on this one anyway. And so it is, trying to think what to say next here on this. So it's definitely a Euphorbia, which you guys probably know a fair bit about them. They're a really common genus to plant in yards, and they're really cool looking flowers, and you can see why they were appealing. People who are planting them, by the way, like they often talk, I've heard from a few people say, I got that at a plant sale like 12 years ago or 15 years ago. So it seems like kind of in that time frame, people were planting this in Corvallis and Philomath for sure. And I think North Albany a bit too. But this Euphorbia is unique in that its plant parts come in 3s typically. And there's a lot out here that look a lot like, see if I can kind of show you guys. So if you see here's like a 1, 2, 3 bracts, and then there's like a little circular kind of thing in the middle, and then there's 3 small little flowers around it. So that's one way you can tell it. It's always important to look at all the flowers instead of just one, because this is in 2s right here, right? But that's still definitely oblong spurge. You got 3 here, you got 3 there. This one's kind of, maybe it's 3, but it's got an egg leaf or oblong shaped leaf, whereas a lot of euphorbias are much more narrow and long than that. And then, for me, as we've gotten to survey around the neighborhood, and Althea, who's in the back's done a lot of this too, because she helped us last year, is sometimes you can just see a bunch of plants that are kind of acting like oblong spurge and that they're obviously being aggressive like this one here. And so this is near the North Co-op. And these folks, we never lifted a finger to help these folks. They just did this on their own, which is great. They used gloves for sure, and hopefully even protective eyewear, really, to protect your eyes. And they pulled all of this, bagged it up, hit the dumpster with it like we talked about before. And now they have put some grass in there. And I think that was just because that's a little bit more competitive to sort of take that site back over. It had been kind of a mix of gravel that was in there. But it's really cool because if you walk by there now, you don't see any oblong spurge. And you might occasionally see like a couple little leaves that poke up, but they're on top of it, which is cool. Yeah.
What are you recommending that people do?
So it's one, because we're really trying to track it. It's nice to know where it is for us at the district. We are totally cool. Like if somebody says, we'll pull it ourselves, we don't really want you to come help us. Like we got this, we totally get that, because it's not like it's terribly difficult to pull, especially if you just have a couple of plants, but we do like to sort of track it. we kind of do like a spy mission where we walk neighborhoods looking for it, and it sounds like really kind of uncool and like we're getting into your privacy, but we do like to try to walk by properties in different neighborhoods and see if we see it in people's front yards, and then if so, we can send them a postcard to say, we noticed you have this and we'd love to talk with you about it. Because with A-list species, I'm not like we want to go to this length, but you can legally be told you have to remove them. That's a special thing for A-list species because they are like thought to be a hazard and a nuisance out there. That's very rare that the Oregon Department of Agriculture has to knock on people's door and demand that they remove something. You can usually work it out, but it is why we try to highlight this weed and talk to folks about it. Let's see if I can. Yeah, so you could just email me and I'll put that up at the end and say, hey, I think I saw it at 937 Northwest, whatever. And then we can kind of go and just try to walk by and verify it or get a hold of the person. But there's also Oregon Invasive Species Hotline, which I'll show the link at the end that you can go to map and report these weeds, and you can report any weed you want on there. But the truth is, if you do like Scotch broom or blackberry on there, you're just going to get kind of a canned response from someone like me to say, yeah, we got a lot of that out there, but thanks for, thanks for letting us know. But these higher priority weeds are really good to know about, especially, and I'll show a couple other ones that I think could be our next ones that we'll see one day that I would love to know about.
So why is this noxious? I mean, in that mole spurge is also toxic.
Yeah.
Stuff, and it's also very spready. So why not that one? This one?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot of folks in the room that know more about euphorbias overall than I do, but I feel like they're all, so many of them have a tendency to be a bit weedy and they kind of go into spaces you didn't really want them. Oblong spurge, I think, is high priority in A-list species for a few reasons. I think one of it is, I think it might be, if you measured it out, maybe a little more toxic than some of the other ones. I think because it really has that potential to grow on both moist. This is kind of getting into my next slide here. It can grow on a pretty wide range of soils from moist to dry. And so it can really grow in that oak woodland or oak savanna type of habitat, which is, like more of a threatened habitat in a sense that we're trying to take care of, a really sensitive one. And then I think because it hasn't been found on that many sites, we think we can eradicate it. So it's more enticing to call it an A-list weed because we think we can actually win. In projects like we're doing, which I think are still really valuable. I want everyone to participate and tell us about oblong spurge. When we're starting to get to 50 sites just in Corvallis, now we're like, well, that's kind of depressing because we were hoping we'd like, oh, we found the 13 places it is and we got rid of it. But I mean, I think we'll find even more this next year as we keep working on it. So this species, I would say to still keep prioritizing it, but if it went to a B-list species in the next 5 years, it wouldn't surprise me because folks in Portland are finding it more and more places now that the word is getting out about it. So that's a huge thing. And that's why I'm here tonight. It's like, it's great to talk to folks like you that are out on the ground and looking at things, because the more you do that, the more you get reports and the more you start to really size up these actual issues. So this is a site on Vineyard Mountain where it's just kind of about a half acre of open grass where those little like leaves on the bottom is just like a carpet of oblong spurge because it's just been growing there a long time. But if we have 50 sites in Corvallis, Philomath, North Albany, I would say probably like 46 or 7 of them, I could walk you over to the like mother plant, like that started the whole thing. And, like usually someone planted it or their neighbor did. There's only a few where I'm like, wow, how did this one get here? One, like Althea found a couple of those this year where it's like, I don't know where that one came from. That's a mystery, but we might find out one day. I know I'm spending kind of too much of my allotted time on just one species. I'll start to move a little quicker here, but I just wanted to show you guys like that root there at the bottom is a pretty thick root by my garden glove. But then you can see that other one in the middle is kind of, I know it's not that easy to see, but at the bottom you can kind of see like a much skinnier kind of whippy little root. And this is one that if you do it in moist conditions and you just got a few plants, you can get the whole root. It reproduces by seed. It doesn't have all these rhizomes that are all left out there that are going to drive you crazy. So if we get to the end, if people want to ask more questions about some of these weeds, because I should probably pick up my pace a little bit, we can always talk more. So oblong spurge It's a very different plant than spurge laurel. So that's one thing you got to watch out at Benton SWCD is when you tell everybody to look for oblong spurge, is you'll get a lot of spurge laurel reports too, because people will get just kind of mixed up. But a lot of you probably know Daphnes are these really fragrant, really cool plants. Some of them that you can grow in your yard. And that's what spurge laurel is. It is a Daphne, but it doesn't mean every Daphne is a bad weed. Just the spurge laurel one is. And what I think is kind of unique about spurge laurel is that it doesn't follow a lot of the same characteristics of a lot of invasive weeds in that it doesn't really seed that crazy. It doesn't, like some of these, just like they put off 1 million seeds twice a growing season. It feels like these don't seed that much, and they also grow pretty slow. So usually you'd be like, well, it sounds very manageable to me. But the problem with spurge laurel, I think, is and it's got some toxicities to wildlife or animals. Wildlife don't eat it. It's not like tansy ragwort where like you're, but it's not palatable for sure, and it's got some toxicity to it. But I think one of the reasons why it has done so well is that it's shade tolerant, so it can hang in a lot of different environments. And then it also looks a little bit like a rhododendron almost when you see those green leathery leaves. And I think people just like it, like a lot of these weeds, people just like them, and then also I know in a lot of the north part of town is deer don't eat this. So I think some folks see it and they go, well, the deer let that one alone. So let's just go with that. Another spot that's interesting to look at though, to see the impacts of it. And I hate, again, I could be ratting somebody out, but if you're driving north on Highland, like you're going to Crescent Valley High School and you're about to drop down the bigger hill there, so you're still south of the high school going north towards it, and you go down the hill, right before you start to go down that hill, if you look to the right, there's a major understory that's like entirely spurge laurel. And I've talked with that person and we were going to try to deal with it, but then I haven't gotten a call back from it. Again, sorry if it's one of you, but I think this person lives out of town. And they just were like, they actually said, we didn't know what that was, but we did notice there's a ton of it, So, and I'm not even trying to like make fun of them at all, but they were like, they're just a little bit, they just don't live around here and they haven't really dealt with it. But this is another one that you can, when you get it, when it's smaller, you can often pull its entire root out, which is cool. I would assume there's not a ton of herbicide users in the room, but if you do use herbicides, they don't really work much on the leaves of this shrub. You could cut one and stump treat it if you wanted to, and it would kill off the roots. And that can be a good mechanism for a lot of our woody, weedy species. The next two I'll talk about together. So this is Italian arum, and there's a lot of it in Corvallis. And I say Corvallis, but Philomath has plenty of this too in North Albany, and probably Monroe even has some, that kind of thing. But this is a variegated arrow-shaped leaf with really cool looking fruits. So you'd obviously want this one in your yard. It's like really cool looking. And it's Italian. Yeah, it can be called Italian Lords and Ladies as well, which is a fun name. And then Lesser Celandine is actually a buttercup, but it's nice to talk about it with the arum, not because they're actually growing together in one of these pictures in the middle, if you notice that. But they're both like showy flowers, pretty cool looking leaves, but they can really spread. And once they get going, they're about impossible to wrap your head around. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, they quite possibly could be. I mean, there's some. Yeah, they could quite possibly spread pretty well too. There's a lot of debate with invasive species, I guess, like enthusiasts out there too, where you get like there's like a butterfly bush. Butterfly bush can be really invasive, and they were supposedly creating one in the nursery industry that would be like sterile. But then some folks are like, I bought one of those and it started spreading around my yard anyway. So you kind of wonder if they've really got it fully nailed down. But then again, like what if they just didn't get the sterile one? They thought they did. I don't, who knows what happened there exactly. So So yeah, I think if it's a ranunculus ficaria, unless it's really been the spreadiness has really been somehow bred out of it, I would think it would still spread. And I think a big reason why it does is just to like, once you start to find it and you want to remove it, we've got celandine on the left and we got the arum on the right. They kind of have these corms or bulbs or nutlets that you can't pull out of the ground by just hand pulling. You actually have to dig them out. And you might get some that are about half the size of a golf ball, or you might get others that are smaller than a marble, and you just really don't see them in the dirt you're digging out. So it's commonly said to dig these out with a shovel and then throw away your whole shovel full of dirt because you don't know. But you know, obviously that's like, it's like I'm a soil conservationist here. I can't tell you to do that. So and I have done that before, and I'm like, that hole in the back of our yard has never just naturally refilled itself. Like it's still a hole. So it's kind of tough to talk yourself into that one. But a lot of these weeds, they're so hard to get rid of, but it's just about like realizing that they showed up like right away and dealing with them before they start to spread. What's your question over there? Yeah, I think you could do that if you had some sort of a screen to do the sifting, you could do that. Yeah, because I've seen them quite small, but they're still like bigger than a BB usually, you know, so you could probably do the sifting thing. And I think that rodents move those around in yards sometimes too. Personal hypothesis from what I've seen happen in my yard in Portland when I lived there. So let's talk about ivy for a minute. That's again, you know, everyone pretty much can identify ivy and has dealt with it, but it is like I did work in Portland for a long time, and Portland is kind of trash. Like I was up there visiting recently my old neighborhood in Southwest Portland and driving down the road, seeing it all, and it was almost like a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder sort of reaction of just being like, I hated these forests just because of all this ivy, and they're beautiful. Like I should love them, and I have a forestry degree, but I was just like, oh, I can't stand all this ivy. It's just crazy. And in parts of North Albany near the Willamette River, I noticed there's tons of it. Everyone knows their little pocket of it here in Corvallis too, or in Philomath or in Monroe or wherever you might live, you know. But Corvallis is really, I think, on the whole, doing pretty good with ivy compared to a lot of other cities, which I think would just be the reason to really double down on it and try to deal with ivy because it really can hurt trees. It'd be interesting to see data on trees that were destroyed in the recent ice storm that had ivy on them versus similar trees nearby that didn't, you know, because ivy is extremely heavy, and you really know it when you start doing a big ivy pull and you're starting to try to like maybe get some of it into a dumpster. It's crazy heavy. It's got so much water stored into it. So you can just imagine a tree trying to hold all of that up and why these limbs break off and that kind of thing. So ivy can grow on the ground, it can grow on the fence, it can grow up your house, it can grow up your mailbox, it can grow up trees, obviously, all those different places. And again, it's one of those ones that's shade tolerant and definitely displaces native ground cover. So you really can see ivy take over space out in the forest, and you won't see trilliums of French cups or piggyback plants or irises or those things anymore.
Is there varieties that are less aggressive?
Not, I mean, maybe like a little bit, but most of the ones, so when you're in the Portland area, I know you could come across 3 different species of ivy. And it's an Irish ivy, an English ivy, and a Persian ivy. And a lot of the stuff that's called English ivy is actually Irish ivy, is what a lot of the taxonomists say, which is Hydera hibernica instead of Hydera helix, which is the one that you most often see referenced. But I think all of those are just like really pretty aggressive. So like the differences in them is just like they're all worth kind of dealing with. But I think there are areas where it was planted more as a ground cover where it's gotten to be worse down in the long run. Whereas, you know, maybe in some sections of Corvallis where I'm surprised we don't have as much of it, it just never was planted as a ground cover very much in that neighborhood or that kind of thing. What I would say about ivy is really the priority from an ecologist point of view is to get it out of trees first if you only got so much time on your hands to work on it, because it can hurt the tree, but it also goes to seed and reproduces when it gets up in the air and higher above ground. It doesn't really reproduce and seed on the ground nearly as much. And what this person's done here is really cool in the photos where they've cut ivy around the base of the tree. And then they've even pulled it back to make what some folks call a lifesaver ring around the bottom. And in that, if she walked away and never came back, you know, in 3 or 4 years, it would be growing up the tree again, but you do buy some time by doing that. And then ivy has to have soil contact to grow. It doesn't get nutrients from trees or the plants that it's growing on. So a lot of people think it does. And it looks like it does. And it definitely sends these little root-like projections that grip, that'll, like, you know, like if you pull it off your house, it'll peel the paint right off because they're so sticky. But this person has all of that ivy above that person will die and turn brown, and then it'll kind of weather away over a couple of years. So that's a really cool thing to do, is remove it from trees. And sometimes it's huge, you know, you have to use a machete or a chainsaw to get rid of it. The one on the photo on the right is dramatic, but the photo on the left is like, you know, you see that all the time in areas where ivy's been around for decades, thicker stuff. And that stuff you just might not be able to peel it away from the tree, but just cutting like an inch around where you sever it all is really, really helpful. Ivy, just a couple of things about ground ivy, or ivy that's on the ground. I'd hate to say ground ivy, I say that a lot, but there's actually a species that's commonly called ground ivy or creeping Charlie, which that's but the ivy that's growing on the ground. It's really cool if you're going to do pulling events to work together as a team in close proximity. My first ever weed pulling event for ivy that I was just like a participant at, I recognized at the end that we had all spread out, and I turned around and I was like, you can't tell that people really pulled ivy in that forest today, because like I had made a little circle and someone 30 feet over there had made a little circle. It's cool to get together here and do even that carpet rolling technique, which is to kind of pull at it and start rolling it backwards. And then you can really make more of an impact. And then I like to make a note on ivy is just countless times when I worked in the Portland area, I heard folks say that they bought such and such chemical at Home Depot and they sprayed it on the ivy and it seemed to help. It seemed to kind of do a little bit of a job on it. And I really would say there's no herbicide that you can purchase that at Home Depot that would kill ivy. But there are herbicide mixes you can concoct yourself that will, and they're legal and they're okay to use. But just because you see some leaves turn a little bit brown doesn't mean you made much impact on a weed. So as a soil and water conservation district, we use herbicides on large projects to kind of get ahead of the weeds, and then we get away from them over time. It's kind of like our philosophy, unofficially, I guess, but that's kind of our philosophy. But what's the worst is when you hear people using an herbicide that you know didn't probably do anything on that weed, used it at the wrong time, used too much of it. You know, it's like that really is kind of like poison on the ground now that didn't do anything. So, but in Portland, they use herbicides on ivy that they've done a bunch of studies on to come up with the right concoction that actually makes a difference. But you have to apply it usually 3 times or more before you really make much of a difference.
Is the formula online?
It's a mix of triclopyr and glyphosate, I'll tell you. And you have to use a surfactant like a competitor, which is a vegetable oil. And you do, I have a pesticide applicator's license, so I can say all this. You do, actually, I shouldn't say it's 2% triclopyr and 4% glyphosate and 2% competitor surfactant. But you have to mix them in the correct order too. And it actually says this on the label that you can make them inert by doing them like backwards. Yeah. I have a hard time believing like that's physically possible, but I've seen it in writing before. I think you do the triclopyr, then you add the glyphosate. But anyway, it's a mix. So it's like those, but like I'm not trying to make sure I tell you guys this special chemical mix, but what is nice to know for ivy is that you can go to like you know, ag supply stores that do sell larger, like 2.5 gallon bottles of herbicides, and you can sometimes get the things that are the most targeted for what you're really trying to kill. So if you're using herbicides, that is like a good way to go, rather than just buying something off the shelf that you hope is doing a good job. Holly is a good one to talk about. Now, holly is grown in Oregon as a nursery product, and it's a very lucrative business. So guess what? It's not on the ODA noxious weed list. Yeah. And people really like having it growing in their yards or on the edges of their forests and things too, because they like the way it looks. But and holly's an interesting one too. So it's shade tolerant, and so it'll persist a long time. But a lot of folks will say, holly doesn't really spread on my place. I don't know why you guys make such a big deal about it, but it's really more of the thought that birds eat those berries and move them to other places. And so you see holly in a lot of really nice forests where you're like, oh, this place feels pretty intact, but there's some holly growing there. Show this picture 1 second on the question. I just wanted to show while I'm rolling kind of is holly. It can be nice to, if you got a bigger one, to do this girdling approach that you see in the bottom left photo, which you're kind of severing its lifeline and not letting it translocate. I don't know if translocate's the right word, but you're not letting it, those xylem and the phloem work anymore, right? You're not letting it bring nutrients to itself. So then it'll die, and none of that stuff's happening in the heartwood of the tree. It's all happening on the outside in that cambium, xylem, phloem kind of layer. So if you do a girdle, it should die. And that often seems like it doesn't sprout as much for holly as when you just cut it down and fall it. And if you fall it, might even, the branches could even kind of root with like that vegetative move called layering, where they put down roots and they grow again. Do you have a question?
Is it? Okay, that's different from common names. English ivy isn't either Great Britain or is it East Coast, Holland?
So there is some ilex, which is the genus for holly that I think grows on the East Coast of the United States. Yeah. Yeah. And so this is a different species than that. Yeah. This is more from Europe. And it's funny. It's like, so you can get into a lot of discussion on noxious weeds or noxious or invasive species, even like different names for crabs and things like that. There's a lot of English or Japanese or Russian. And it's like, we really need to probably come through and do different names for a lot of things, because it sounds like, I mean, I've been out on site visits before and I've said to the landowners, I said, you think I had a thing against the English because I've talked to you about English hawthorn, English ivy, English holly, English laurel. And those are all on like every property in Portland, I swear it seems like. But and I keep bringing up Portland just because I did a lot of work in the forest, but these pictures on most of them, all of them I'm showing from you are from Corvallis, and these are just definitely issues all through around this area too. Okay, I'm getting towards the end here. I want to say this for a minute. There's a lot of geraniums out there that really can move out and form carpets in our natural areas, and we do get them in our yards here in the Benton County area. Herb Robert and shiny geranium, they're each a little different. The one on the left is the Herb Robert, the one on the right is the shiny geranium. I would say Herb Robert's a little bit easier to hand pull and get the roots. Shiny geranium tends to want to snap off a little bit more. There used to be a lot more work done in the ecologist kind of community on these, with people trying to do herbicide treatments and stuff like that. The one thing is they're like mice, I think, can reproduce like 6 times in a year or something. Like Herb Roberts like that. Like it's like it goes to seed a bunch of different times. And so it's just like with chemical controls, you're never catching up to that seed cycle. So it's really just important to find these when they're new to your property, or even if you have a lot of them on your property, but they're new to this one area. Try to pull them early on and get rid of them before they really become a huge infestation. So most all of our geraniums, besides the native Oregon geranium, will have a pretty small pink flower. That's like the size of the one that you see in the picture. There's like the size of like your thumbnail. They're pretty small flowers. So a lot of these, I'm not giving you like real specific ID characteristics, but at least you're kind of getting the names and you can look them up more in your field guides and things. And then this picture on the bottom right is just kind of like that fibrous root of an Herb Robert. And so if you kind of rock it out of the ground and pull it sort of slowly, you often will get just about all of that. Yeah, right. Pull it the minute you see it if it's new, because it just establishes really quickly because of all that seeding that it does. Next one is just knotweed. Knotweed's really famous for infesting upper stretches of the Marys River and the Lucky Mute. But you'll see it growing in people's yards in the county as well. And it's just a nice one to try to get rid of and really be smart about how you dispose of it, because this is the one I was saying earlier. If you tossed it in someone's yard as an evil prank, it could probably start to just grow from the material you threw on their yard. And here's pictures of it. There's lots of spots on the Lucky Mute that used to look like this. Some still do, But I'm really thankful to the Marys River and Lucky Butte Watershed Councils for all the work they've done on knotweed, because I spent a lot of time on the Willamette River, and you don't see knotweed on the Willamette River from Peoria to Albany. I'm not going to say you'll never see it there, but it's not like a monoculture anymore there, which is really great. So, and I guess knotweed, when you have honeybees near it, the honey is really good. I feel like I've heard that from people, but don't tell anyone I said that, because we don't want anyone to favor knotweed. Yeah, so you can kind of see where that's a monoculture though, and that would be really nice if that riparian area or streamside area was a diverse mix of native trees and shrubs instead of all knotweed. It doesn't stabilize banks all that well. Yeah, so that's one. And so you will hear, I'm not trying to be like the chemical guy, but you'll hear some people say never even deal with it mechanically, just try to use herbicide on it, because they just don't want to see people handling those weeds and disposing of them the wrong way. All right, 3 slides left. This one I wanted to point out, because if you really press me to say, what are the next 2 really high priority weeds we'll see in Benton County, I'd probably say orange hawkweed and garlic mustard. They both grow in, and garlic mustard has been seen in Benton County before near, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some in Benton County, just because there's a lot of it in the metro area of Portland, and Gales Creek out in like Forest Grove. There's some of this, like it's around, it's in Salem. But garlic mustard was definitely growing at it's the South Town, the co-op. There's like, was it what? Wildfire Pizza or Fireside or whatever. Fireworks. Or it used to be in Taba's Kitchen a long time ago. But right in that landscaping there was some garlic mustard, but I think that got eradicated. But it's shade tolerant, so it can really grow in the forest really well. When you go to places in the Midwest like Ohio, it's just like it is the forest understory in so many locations. And then orange hawkweed's a super cool looking plant that blooms early with that really nice looking flower. And so I could see that popping up on roadsides, because it kind of likes disturbance, but it's going to be a little different than garlic mustard. It likes a lot more sun. Garlic mustard is shade tolerant, but it's cool with sun also. So those are some that I think are neat to show communities like this that are out a lot and talk to people, because it would be neat to give a preview of these, right? Like people are kind of looking for these weeds, and if they think they see that really wavy looking kind of arrow-shaped leaf of the garlic mustard, it's cool to maybe check in. So, oh, it splashed back in my face. But that's good. It feels great actually. So these are really cool though to report to folks like the Benton Soil and Water Conservation District, because if it's a false alarm, that's fine, but it's kind of almost fun to go out and just sort of see if this is like really the treasure you're looking for, or the opposite of that. Yeah, so well, actually, no, great question. I'm glad you said that, because I was going to forget this. They might both be B list. Orange hawkweed might still be A list. Sorry, I don't actually know the answer to that one, but garlic mustard is B list. And so garlic mustard, people are still getting some funds from the Oregon State Weed Board to kind of work on it in the Portland, Tualatin, Clackamas kind of area. But since we don't have it here, if it showed up here, knowing like what it's capable of, we locally would treat it like it's A list. And what it would then become is a T list species, meaning it's got a specific strategy from the Oregon Department of Agriculture on how we should handle it. So if we had garlic mustard that showed up in Benton County, I would be inclined to try to write one of those grants to the Oregon State Weed Board to see if we can kind of fund more of our time or hire seasonal folks to help us locate it and treat it. So when we get grants for these weeds, we try to hire staff that could do more surveying, neighborhood walks, in the case of the oblong spurge. And then we also have some funds to work with some of our local contractors to come take out the bigger populations of it that we find. But a lot of times we just pull it ourselves too. So we're really interested to know about these. There's 2 A-list species just for fun in Benton County. It was the oblong spurge I talked about. Then the other one is yellow floating heart, Nymphoides peltata, which is the lily pad on the right. Not every lily pad is Nymphoides peltata, though. Some of them are okay. So, but this one has a little reddish, pinkish, or purplish kind of outline on it at times, and it kind of has like a wavy edge. And it doesn't have a stem that comes up to the middle of the lily pad and with like a full circle around it. There's a notch everywhere that you see where that stem comes in. And then it has a yellow flower. So like when you're on the river, every invasive species that we really prioritize seems to have yellow flowers. Like Ludwigia.
Sure, could we take a picture and send it to you?
Yeah, or
I
yeah,
mean, I have the ID app and all of that, but
if you're not sure, a picture is great. And that's actually one of the things I wrote on here is like, it's cool when you send me 3 pictures.
Okay.
One of them of kind of the population, so you can kind of see how it's all like acting or behaving in a sense. And then one of like a zoom into the flower. And then photo 3 right here, just kind of anything else characteristic. Like maybe you're like, wow, these leaves are super hairy. Like, let's see a picture of that. Or the stem's got hair all over it. Take a picture of that and include that too. And that's the thing is a lot of people will write me these questions and they'll have all this descriptive information. And it's like every one of us has a decent camera in our pocket now. It's like, why didn't you take a picture and send that? But so often I just ask, do you have a picture of it? And people, well, they know where it is. They'll go back and take pictures sometimes, but it's cool to do that. And then you can also go to the Oregon Invasive Species Hotline, which is, do I not have the, I would just search Oregon Invasive Species Hotline online. It'll be the first thing that pops up. It's a well-used website anyway. And you can go in there and you can report weeds there too, which is cool. And when you report them there, I get an alert at my email for Benton County that says that I should look into it. And we don't get a lot on here. We get 6 or 7, well, maybe like a dozen hits a year. And some of them will just be like knapweed or something where it's like, yeah, that's a problem weed, but it's not like, we don't necessarily have funds to go deal with that for people the way we do some of these other weeds. Yeah, and then if you have details on location that you can share when you see some of these weeds, that's really cool too, because it's, a lot of times we can do a drive-by or bike by them on the way to the office or something and see what we can see. But again, since I don't know how many of you all like volunteer for the Master Gardeners hotline or things like that. I know you guys table at events and stuff, but getting the chance to talk to Master Gardeners is actually super awesome for the Soil and Water Conservation District. So just kind of in conclusion, you guys can ask me some questions here. I really appreciate the chance to talk to folks like this. And I just encourage you to talk to people about invasive species when they call in or they see you at the table, wherever you may be. All right, does anyone else have any other good invasive species stories or questions?
Nope, I'm watching the chat. That's all me rephrasing questions from the room.
Thanks for doing that. I'm never good at repeating them.
So is poison oak an invasive species?
Yeah, so that's a funny one. Like when we go to treat oblong spurge at some sites, people will be like, have them get rid of my poison oak while they're at it, because we have contractors come out and do some of it. In a lot of cases, that's like would be like a really major add-on to the project to take care of the person's poison oak as well. So poison oak's a native species. So it's kind of tough to be like too aggressive at it as like a public organization. And then some people would say it even is nice because I think wildlife will sometimes eat those berries and stuff too. So
As a follow-up, because you had showed the photo earlier of the ivy.
Yeah.
The tree, and on our property, we'll have poison oak
yeah.
stumps, they're huge going up that are quite.
Yeah. So the cool thing is like the poison oak will drop its leaves in the winter. So if you're ever getting, phone calls or someone's really having trouble, they don't know if they've got poison oak or if it's ivy. I just try to talk through like the leaf ID. If you have them both on the same tree, which I've seen before, you kind of got to choose your battles at that point. I can't give formal advice on that one, but usually they look, different enough because the ivy leaf is really leathery. And I mean, I guess the poison oak kind of is too, but the shapes are enough different. And then ivy leaves typically, when they get older or they're like later in the year, they'll have almost a little bit of like a variegation to them with like some white in the leaf. But they won't be really, really hairy stems on the ivy, whereas the poison oak will look more hairy with all of the little roots that come out of it.
Question from the chat. In town, far from where animals are grazing, Is it wrong to allow tansy for the caterpillars?
So I would say if you've got it in town, and you see the caterpillars are on it, that it can be okay to maybe it can be a bit of a public health kind of nuisance, right? So you get a really bad rash from pulling tansy, but it's almost like poison oak, where some people aren't allergic to it, but some people are. Like some people pull tansy all day long, just like with their hands, and they seem okay. Okay. But it can be important to probably remove it if it's in like more of a public setting, I would say. And if you see isolated populations of weeds like tansy, so I guess I should back up. What they're talking about is these caterpillars that turn into cinnabar moths, and they're a biocontrol that eats tansy and therefore decreases its population. So it doesn't eradicate tansy, it just draws its population down quite a bit. So if you are on an isolated population of, let's say, purple loosestrife, which is just a Willamette River weed, and it also has biocontrol, and you see the bug is all over it, then you might want to leave it alone and let the bug do its thing. If you don't see the bug on it, you might choose to pull it or treat it somehow. And that's always a little bit of a debate, because if it's like really isolated, you're like, oh man, I don't know if the bugs are ever going to find this. So, but if you do see tansy and it's got those caterpillars all over it, they'll probably take care of it pretty well, but you may not want it around people.
Lisa Borgerson mentioned that you could possibly cut the flower heads off, but leave the leaves and let the caterpillar eat the rest of it.
Yeah.
And there's another question. Is it possible to be sure of the ID of the English ivy before cutting it down? Is there anything else that looks like that? Is variegated holly a problem too?
Yeah, I mean, so the variegated holly. So I think that folks have tried to breed hollies that won't spread as much. I don't know. I wouldn't know how to say if this is one of those ones that's going to spread a lot or this one's not. So I'm in favor of trying to be kind of aggressive with holly. So that's what I would say to that. Even if it's variegated, I'd probably still try to get rid of it. I mean, there's always going to be people that are letting a noxious weed persist on their property because they like it. And that's not the end of the world, especially because these aren't A-list species, most of what we talked about. For the ivy, though, there really isn't. If you know it's going to be one of these Hederas, which is the genus that's English ivy, Irish ivy, or Persian ivy, there's really not a good one of those. Every one of those is going to be aggressive and will spread and could damage your tree. Now, there are things like Virginia creeper out there. I don't know if we ever find that in Oregon, or poison ivy, poison oak. Yeah. Or you might have Western trumpet honeysuckle, the Lonicera ciliosa, that can grow up trees, and it's native. It'll actually damage small shrubs though and kind of choke them. It's kind of weird, but that's just natural disturbance. You got to let it go. But not every vine is bad. So grapevines will get out and take over trees kind of. Sometimes you get the vitis. So that could be a thing too. I feel like I'm not giving the most conclusive answers. I'm just talking and there's more to think about. Yeah.
So years ago, Keith used to do a weed spotters
Mhm.
class. Well, we're going to do that for people who are interested in becoming more adept at doing weed spotting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, but I do think a weed spotters class would be kind of cool to bring back too. Just to I really would love to. It's like we have the emerald ash borer in Oregon now. And it's really cool that in Oregon, a lot of people that I've worked with in the past did a ton of work to educate people about emerald ash borer before it was even here, right? Like a little bit of like, what do you do about it? But really how to identify its D-shaped exit holes and things like that. And so with invasive weeds, it's kind of cool to do that too. That's like why I want to have that slide to be like, look out for garlic mustard and orange hawkweed, and there probably is a few more of those I could throw in and do more of a weed spotters training. So yeah, people think that would be interesting. That could be worth working on. for sure. You probably borrow a lot of slides from other SWCDs that do those and just say, let's go.
Well, one of the reasons I asked is that when we took the class, she had a really nice handout, like pesticide page. You could
Yeah.
take out with you and had, information about where that,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But again, I mean, like, and we do, like, I probably get more questions just over email from people that go hiking in the McDonald Dun and see something interesting than I do responses to this hotline website. They're both great ways to get a hold of people. It's just, sometimes that emails directly to me or somebody at the district might even almost be better because you can pinpoint more of the photos you want to share or whatever. But, so that's a good way to show folks too. But yeah, we could do more weed spotters work.
I see holly growing around, but you don't want us to tell you about holly. do you?
No, I mean, a lot of this is just motivation to say, like, if you see this, in your yard and things, it is worth trying to get rid of it. Like a lot of these weeds, if you're a landscaper of your yard and you want to have cool plants, you probably already kind of hate some of these, right? Like you're just like, oh, I don't want to have that around. So, no, it's like, yeah, the you don't need to report many of these really. It's more just better to educate you all about how to remove them and to talk to your neighbors, your friends and stuff.
I wanted to say it was really helpful to hear about the holly because I have cut it way back to the ground and got a really bushy holly.
Yeah, so
Good to know.
and it's like I talked a little bit about stump sprouting. You see that like even in like big leaf maple, if it gets cut, and oak will do it some too, Oregon white oak. Holly will do that, but it'll also root sprout like 12 feet away. Yeah, so you get a grove of the little ones where you're like, I mean, there's places where I feel like people should have just let the one stem go that was there and never bothered with it because. So a lot of people will stump treat a holly with herbicide to try to kill its roots when they cut it. Yeah.
Is there really real progress on controlling, in your side, like in Florida area? I got up there, it seems like I see more of the kind of guy up there. I like to hear from-
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of reasons for that, because it's just hard to deal with, and it is shade tolerant, so there's not a lot of conditions it doesn't like. It'll grow on really poor soil, it'll grow right out of clay, things like that. Also, like when it's growing in transportation projects, like it's on the side of a highway in Portland, it's like it's kind of hard to even talk to the transportation folks about why it's bad. They're like, well, it stays green and they're like sometimes you remove ivy and you can't get anything else to grow on that site, and it's like maybe you didn't even need to mess with the ivy in this rare situation. Usually it's good to deal with it. But we've made progress on it when I worked there in some places but it's a lot of investment. It's you could have 10 acres you're trying to treat and spend more than $30,000 trying to deal with the ivy because you'd probably come in and do herbicide treatments when it's at that scale. You do 3 of them at least, and you'd still never eradicate it, but you could at least get the site to a spot where you could plant some other things in there to kind of start to fill in now that the ivy's been greatly knocked back. But it's like you would do a spray treatment in the fall, the next spring, and then again in the next fall, before you even started bringing plants in. Hand pulling's even better. It's just you can't do that at the scale you need to. Like a forest park is a 5,000 acre park, and probably 2,000 acres have a major ivy problem. So.
And the guy who's not right, he spent a good quite a few days cutting off an engine by Crescent Valley.
Yeah.
And I've been doing physical therapy.
I-
I said, great, but there was one tree with no ivy or dead ivy. and
Yeah.
30 other ones that it was getting taller.
Another funny thing with ivy too is like if you miss just one small vine, it seems like somehow that one small vine you missed manages to power the whole like canopy. Like that was the secret one or something.
The forest park, everything emphasizing the volunteers to cut it from the trees, because that's when it sets the areas or whatever.
Yeah.
And the birds propagating elsewhere, so.
Yeah, so that's an effort to kind of save the trees when you probably don't have the time or resources to deal with all of the ivy. So you prioritize it that way, which is, I think, a really great thing for folks to do when they're kind of stuck in a spot where ivy's been there for decades and it's really quite the job. But I've also worked on sites where we did, a half acre of removal with volunteer events for multiple weekends in a growing season. And once you get it all pulled, some will grow back. You're not going to get every root. But those sites, really, what comes back even on its own can just blow your mind with all. I mean, I have photos of where it was pulled in November, and then I have photos in April, where just like one shot from my phone looking down at the ground has like 14 trillium in just that little picture, so that's kind of nice. And that's a nice reason not to maybe use the herbicides, if you think you can just do it by hand. And it's really, in ivy, it's so important if you ever do use herbicides on it to eventually transition away from them, because if you're spot spraying every leaf that you still see coming back, you're going to do, at that point, you're definitely doing more damage to the native stuff that would love to come up. So you got to back off them in that situation for sure.
We wrap it up?
Yeah. I mean, I could go longer, but it's late. All right. Thank you. I guess I gotta get my flash drive out of here. Thank you, Zoom.